The Syrian War, also known as the Syrian Civil War, is an ongoing armed conflict that started in 2011. It has resulted in the displacement of millions of people and the deaths of hundreds of thousands. The conflict has been complicated and multifaceted, with many different actors involved, and it has had a significant impact on the region and the world. The Syrian War began as part of the wider Arab Spring uprisings that swept through North Africa and the Middle East in 2011. In Syria, the uprising started in March 2011, with peaceful protests calling for political and economic reforms. However, the government of President Bashar al-Assad responded with violence, including the use of the military and security forces to suppress the protests. This led to an escalation of violence and the emergence of armed opposition groups, which eventually formed into a loose coalition known as the Free Syrian Army, FSA. The conflict quickly became more complex as other groups, including Kurdish militias and extremist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda, became involved. The Syrian war has drawn in many different international actors, with various interests and objectives. The government of Bashar al-Assad has received support from Russia and Iran, who see him as an important ally in the region. Russia has provided military and diplomatic support to the Assad regime, while Iran has provided military and financial support. On the other side, the United States, Europe, and many Arab countries have supported the opposition groups, either by providing weapons and training or by supporting diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. However, these countries have often been divided in their approach, with some pushing for a more forceful intervention while others have been more cautious. The Syrian war has had a devastating impact on the Syrian people, with millions of people forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. The UN estimates that more than 13 million people inside Syria require humanitarian assistance, and more than 6 million people have been displaced within the country. The war has also had a severe impact on Syria's infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, and other essential services. The country's economy has been badly affected, with many businesses and industries forced to close or relocate. The conflict has also caused significant damage to Syria's cultural heritage, with many historic sites and artifacts destroyed or damaged. Efforts to find a resolution to the conflict have been ongoing since it began, but progress has been slow and difficult. In 2012, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for a peaceful transition of power in Syria, but this was not implemented, and the conflict continued to escalate. Several rounds of peace talks have been held, with varying levels of participation from the various parties involved. The most significant of these was the Geneva peace talks, which began in 2014 and were organized by the UN. However, the talks failed to make any progress, and the conflict continued. In 2015, Russia intervened in the conflict on behalf of the Assad regime, launching a military campaign that has helped the government regain control of significant territory. This intervention has further complicated efforts to find a resolution to the conflict, with Russia and the Syrian government refusing to negotiate with some of the opposition groups. As of 2021, the Syrian war is still ongoing, although the situation has changed significantly since the early years of the conflict. The government of Bashar al-Assad has regained control of most of the country's territory, with the help of Russian military support. However, the conflict has left deep scars on Syrian society, and the humanitarian situation remains dire. Millions of people are still displaced, and many face ongoing violence and insecurity. The conflict has also had a significant impact on the wider region, with neighboring countries bearing the brunt of the refugee crisis and facing their own security challenges as a result. Despite numerous international efforts to resolve the conflict, the war in Syria continues to rage on. The future of the country remains uncertain, and the human toll of the conflict continues to grow. It is clear that a political solution is needed to bring an end to the suffering of the Syrian people and restore stability to the region. The humanitarian situation has been further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit Syria hard. The country's healthcare system has been severely strained, and the pandemic has further restricted access to essential services for those affected by the conflict. The pandemic has also added an additional layer of complexity to the ongoing humanitarian response in Syria, as aid organizations work to balance the urgent needs of those affected by the war with the need to prevent the spread of the virus. Syria was already facing significant challenges with its healthcare system prior to the pandemic, with many hospitals and clinics destroyed or damaged during the conflict. The pandemic has only served to further strain the system, with shortages of medical equipment and supplies, and healthcare workers struggling to cope with the influx of patients. The pandemic has also had a significant impact on the economy, exacerbating existing economic challenges and leading to widespread job losses and reduced access to basic goods and services. The economic impact of the pandemic has been particularly severe for vulnerable populations, including internally displaced persons and refugees. In addition to the impact on the healthcare system and the economy, the pandemic has also had significant implications for education in Syria. With schools and universities closed for extended periods, many children and young people have been left without access to education, exacerbating existing challenges with low literacy rates and limited access to educational opportunities. The pandemic has also added an additional layer of complexity to the humanitarian response in Syria, with aid organizations working to adapt their programs to meet the changing needs of those affected by the conflict and the pandemic. This has required a significant investment of resources and the development of new approaches to service delivery. Despite the challenges posed by the pandemic, aid organizations continue to provide critical assistance to those affected by the conflict in Syria. This includes the provision of food and non-food items, shelter, and healthcare services. Aid organizations are also working to provide support for education and livelihoods, in an effort to help vulnerable populations cope with the economic impact of the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has added an additional layer of complexity to the already devastating humanitarian crisis in Syria. The pandemic has further strained the healthcare system and the economy, exacerbating existing challenges faced by vulnerable populations. Despite these challenges, aid organizations continue to work tirelessly to provide critical assistance to those affected by the conflict and the pandemic. It is clear that ongoing support will be needed to help the Syrian people recover from the devastating impact of the war and the pandemic, and to build a more stable and prosperous future.